There are always layers to risk. If you have enough of those holes that line up, it allows for an accident.
The bigger problem here, there were a lot of systemic factors that played into how this accident happened. Hey, well, we pushed this once before and it was fine, so we can continue to do so.
He would have issued it to both and followed up, probably, knowing that they're still on a colliding course.
That last statement to me is insane. The aircraft is supposed to be at 300 feet. That is a completely unacceptable distance of separation. You are incentivized to make clickbait. It is really a disgusting factor of what goes on in the world today.
Take the time to pause and wait for the organizations that are tasked with doing their job of investigating an incident to come out with the facts.
5342 never saw this helicopter until the very, very last second, and it was too late to avoid a collision. Welcome back to the From the Flight Deck podcast. My name's Kyle Kokal. I'm here with Christian Smith, and we are going to be talking about the Washington DCA NTSB findings from the accident that occurred January 29th of 2025. Importantly, what we are about to discuss in this episode are our opinions and our expert, essentially, understanding of what the NTSB said. And really the idea here is to translate the technical jargon that is in this report for somebody that is a nervous flyer. These are not the opinions of the airlines that we work for. These are our opinions and our opinions alone. Christian, welcome back. Good to see you.
Hey, Kyle. Glad to be back.
Right on. So let's just get right into it. On January 29th, 2025, I'm sure everybody's familiar with exactly what happened, but there was a collision between a CRJ 700 operating as call sign Blue Streak 5342, which was a PSA Airlines flight, on approach to Washington DCA's runway 33. We're going to talk about what those different runway numbers mean and things like that. And during that approach, they had a in-flight collision, a midair collision with PAT-25, which was a Army H-60 helicopter, a Black Hawk helicopter on a training mission. And we're going to talk about exactly what all of that means and what happened there. So the National Transportation Safety Board has concluded their investigation, but they have not released their final report as of today, which is Friday, February 6th, 2026. So what we are taking here is all of the findings that they have published on their website, which is 74 bullet points, in addition to their published probable cause and causal factors. Probable cause being this is the main thing that caused the accident here, and causal factors are these contributed to the reason that the accident happened. Christian, do you want to take a second here to introduce the idea of the Swiss cheese model and what we're going to keep coming back to today on why that's so important in this accident?
Absolutely. So when we look at accidents, and this really could be applicable to anything in your life, whether it's something that happens at home personally or in it's something in complex like an airline environment, there are always layers to risk and what we presume risk every day, and different layers of risk will add up, and every single layer of risk has a small possible entry hole or a throughput that allows it to go on to that next layer. The whole goal in aviation is to stack enough of those safety barriers with procedures, technology, training. We put all of these layers together in order to put as many barriers between those like throughput holes of risk as we possibly can. So in an accident like this that we saw in DC back in January of 2025, a number of those layers had those holes line up enough, like a piece of Swiss cheese, right? Mainly one solid piece, but you get the holes in the middle in various spots. If you have enough of those holes that line up, it allows for an accident like we saw in January of 2025 at DCA. And so the concept, and especially in the wake of an accident like this, we as an aviation industry, and I speak on behalf of a number of people when we say that, we try to find ways to close those holes as small as possible and add more layers so those holes don't line up. And it's really impressive, how far we've come in the aviation industry to make this the safest mode of transportation that exists in human history, to really put as many layers and close those holes as much as possible. We'll come back to that concept a lot today.
Absolutely. And one other metaphor to use for this, just in the sense that this is an audio podcast first, and so using the visuals may be a little bit challenging with the Swiss cheese model, but there's another metaphor that you can use here, which we call the links in the accident chain. And so if you consider what a chain looks like, I'm talking metal links, a chain that you would use to secure something, whatever it may be. What we try to do there is stop those links from adding up, because as you add links together in a chain, and when we're specifically talking about the accident chain, you have something like a pilot that makes a mistake and then an air traffic controller that doesn't catch it. That's two links of the chain added together. A third link in this case is going to be the fact that there was a helicopter route underneath a arrival route for an airplane. That's a third link in the chain. So what we want to do is we want to interrupt those links from happening. And what we'll see here is if the PAT-25 helicopter had identified the CRJ-700 appropriately and said, okay, well, yeah, we have the traffic in sight, we're going to turn behind them, that would have stopped the accident chain from linking. We would have had a disconnect in the links, and therefore this accident would not have happened. So links in the accident chain, Swiss cheese model, we'll probably use those interchangeably today, but we just want you to know that that's exactly what we're talking about here. So to get right into it, once again, 74 points that the NTSB made. We're going to take all of those, break them down to plain language. And we're not going to go, number 1 through number 74. We're going to group them together just for the sake of time. But essentially, 1 through 5 have a very similar meaning. So, Christian, let's get right into it. So first to start.
Maybe quick before we get into that, Kyle, I think an important delineation for people to understand too as we review accidents, especially with aviation accidents, these are two separate organizations, right? You have the Federal Aviation Administration as a federal organization that oversees operational training, procedures, safety, all of these things that have to do with airlines. And then the NTSB is a separate federal organization that investigates accidents, not specific just to aviation accidents. They've done a number of maritime accidents. They do train accidents. They do, a number of accident investigations. The NTSB's job is to come in and be a third party. Ideally, we don't have the FAA investigate because that would be a conflict of interest when reviewing their own practices and procedures. So the NTSB came out with these 74 bullet points separate of the Federal Aviation Administration. So they are separate organizations for that specific, design consideration to keep that conflict, apart so we can look at things objectively.
Great point. Yeah, really glad you made that point. Okay, so the first 6 points here in the findings have to do with what we call fit for duty. And what fit for duty means is that these individuals that were operating both Flight 5342 and PAT-25, they were not fatigued. They had appropriate rest before their flight. They were not on duty for a long amount of time. And so what these 6 first bullet points say essentially is the pilots of Flight 5342 were certificated and qualified in accordance with federal regulations. They were medically qualified, and there was no available evidence to indicate that they were impaired by effects of medical conditions, or substances at the time of the accidents. They also look at their awake time before the accident, the rest time that they had the evening before, and things of that nature. And they said that the crews were unlikely to be experiencing fatigue. This is both the flight crew on the CRJ-700 as well as the flight crew on PAT-25. So really just kind of laying the fundamental layer that, hey, these people were in good shape to operate these aircraft. They also go on to say that the air traffic controllers were also not experiencing fatigue necessarily, with the exception of the supervisor in the tower, who we're going to talk about here shortly. They also say in points 7 and 8 that the aircraft, the CRJ-700, was properly certificated, equipped, and maintained in accordance with the appropriate regulations. The aircraft was operated within its normal weight and balance, and examination of the airplane was that there were no mechanical irregularities prior to the contact with the helicopter. The additional point here says the helicopter was also properly certificated, equipped, and maintained in accordance with U.S. Army regulations. There were no mechanical irregularities impacting the helicopter prior to impact with the CRJ-700. Christian, anything you want to add on that?
Nothing for this so far.
Okay.
Keep going.
Sounds good. This is where we start to get into the air traffic controllers being certified fit for duty and their staffing. One of the things that was talked a lot about in the aftermath of this accident was appropriate levels of staffing. I remember in the immediate aftermath, we fielded a lot of questions about, well, air traffic controller safety. Are they appropriately staffed at these different facilities? There's allegedly a big air traffic control shortage going on, which there is. We do want more controllers in towers. But this is what the report goes on to say, and this is bullet points 9 through 13. The operations supervisor and 4 controllers who were working in the Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport Air Traffic Control Tower cab, which is tower facility, at the time of the accident were properly certified, qualified in accordance with federal regulations and facility directives, and current. They do say the tower facility was not staffed to its target level at the time of the accident. The number of staff in the tower at the time of the accident was adequate and in accordance with Federal Aviation Administration directives. So target staffing versus required staffing, 2 very different things. And I want you to note there, Christian, did you catch how many air traffic controllers were in the tower at the time of this accident?
Yeah, 4 controllers, 1 supervisor.
Yeah, so there were 5 people in the tower. But what we're going to uncover here shortly is that 1 controller was actually operating all of the local control, which is the takeoffs and landings, as well as the helicopter traffic. And the NTSB report does point to that being I believe, a contributing factor to this accident. And we'll get to all of that. But I just want to point that out here as we talk about how many controllers were actually in the tower. And here's the point that it makes. The decision to combine the helicopter control and local control positions was not the result of insufficient staffing, and personnel were available to staff the helicopter control and local control positions separately had the operations supervisor chosen to do so. The local controller, assistant local controller, and operations supervisor were medically qualified for duty, and available evidence does not indicate that they were impaired by effects of medical conditions at the time of the accident. So they had the controllers available to staff things like this. I will say that it's not irregular for us to see that, especially late at night, 1 controller is working the tower frequency, 1 controller is working the ground frequency. Granted, I don't have, an inside scoop as to what it looks like in the tower, like how many people are actually over their shoulder supervising, but like it's not uncommon for us to land on a red eye and, we'll turn off the runway and contact the ground controller and it'll be the same voice talking to you. Hey, taxi to gate Alpha 3 via, Bravo Sierra, whatever. Christian, anything you want to add here?
Yeah, I think I try to put myself in the shoes of those controllers, that supervisor in the tower. This is at the time of the accident, 2025, we're over 100 years of aviation and obviously not ran the exact same way that entire time, but certainly probably the 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s. I'm speculating here as those exact dates, but, these guys have been, when I see these guys being the controllers in DC, they've been experienced with this mix of helicopter and commercial aviation traffic for what I would imagine to be decades. And so as you look at this accident with a microscope and like a very crystal clear microscope, it's easy to put ourselves in a position where we go, how could they have possibly made that decision? That's crazy. But in reality, that was probably business as usual for them. I'm not a controller. I have never worked in the DC control tower. So it's hard for me to say if they did that regularly or if that was a one-off. I can't imagine it was much of a one-off. So as we read through these points, it's important to bring that human element into things and put yourself in those people's shoes to say, was this a really crazy decision? And I have a hard time believing that was, a very irregular, operation for them. They probably did that a lot of nights, and especially in January after the holiday season, those guys were probably tired, right? The air carrier world experiences a ton of volume over the holidays. Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year. And so, you're within that 30-day period of coming off a peak holiday season. Those guys are probably pretty tired. And if they're understaffed, that starts to line up some more of those holes in the Swiss cheese model.
Right. Absolutely. And, one of the things that is important to reference here as well is there's nothing precluding you from doing this. There's nothing precluding you from having 1 controller work the local control and the helicopter control as well. There's nothing wrong with that. That was just a decision that the supervisor made. And what they end up pointing to in this report is that had that decision been changed, it may have resulted in a different outcome here. And that's a really hard point to make, I would think, because as I read through this, the controller, in my mind, did what he was supposed to do. He called out the traffic to the helicopter. And we're going to talk more about this, but in reading that, there's nothing to me that I think is, that is the primary factor of this accident. So, business as usual is certainly something that you could reference here as far as how they were staffing the tower. The bigger problem here, and again, something we're going to talk about, is the helicopter route that was underneath the arrival corridor to runway 33. There were a lot of systemic factors that played into how this accident happened, and the air traffic control piece of it is a very small piece in my mind that is one of the links in the accident chain, but they were, in my opinion, a victim of a really poorly set up system that they then had to control and did not have the resources to appropriately do so.
I agree.
So that's my thought. But Christian, I agree with you entirely. This is if this is business as usual, that's the way things go. We're going to talk about something called the normalization of deviance here as well. This is something we talk about a lot in the airline industry. And I want to read you the definition of it real quick. And for the listeners, keep this in mind as we go through this. This is something that had to do with the normalization of deviance. Let me give you the definition, and then we'll come back and talk about it a little bit. The normalization of deviance is the dangerous organizational process where departing from established safety rules or standards becomes accepted practice over time, often because no immediate negative consequences occur. This was coined by sociologist Diane Vaughan regarding the 1986 Challenger space shuttle disaster, and it stems from the pressure to maintain schedules or reduce costs. The normalization transforms unsafe, exceptional shortcuts into the new invisible normal. Now, what that means in the context of the 1986 Challenger disaster was that they had a known engineering problem with one of their parts of the rocket that in freezing temperatures or cold temperatures, that part would fail. And engineers had brought it up and said, hey, this is a problem. And they had come up with all of these different standards in which they could not go outside of as far as temperatures that they could actually launch the shuttle in. And the morning of the disaster, the overnight temperatures had gotten well below freezing, compromising the O-rings. And ultimately, they had an uncontained failure that killed the entire crew on board that 1986 Challenger disaster, or that killed the entire crew on board that 1986 Challenger launch. And it was a normalization to deviance. And it was, hey, well, we pushed this once before and it was fine, so we can continue to do so. And I want to talk about that. What I want you to consider more so is that as you listen to what happened in this accident, as it relates to the way that the airspace was set up, you can start to see that there was some normalization of deviance going on, potentially because of the fact that nothing bad had happened previously. So just keep that in mind as you listen to the route structure and things like that as it relates to DCA specifically. Anything you want to add there, Christian?
No, I think that's good.
Got it. All righty. So we talked about the controller positions already. One of the things that the NTSB report says, this is point number 17, the local control and helicopter control positions should have been separated at the time of the accident given present traffic volume and complexity. I'm not sure if that's a directive based on anything published or if that is just the opinion of the NTSB, but something to note there. So here's a question for you, Christian. One of the things that it says here is, although the local controller provided an initial traffic advisory to the crew of PAT 25 in accordance with the Federal Aviation Administration Job Order 711065, he did not provide a corresponding advisory to the crew of Flight 5342, which could have increased SA for the crew of 5342. If the local, and then the next bullet point, if the local controller had issued a standard safety alert to the flight crews of either aircraft as prescribed in 7110.65, providing the conflicting aircraft's position and positive control instructions, the crew of either aircraft could have taken immediate action to avert the impending collision. I don't see that he failed his duty there to alert 5342 of the traffic, but I'm not sure.
Probably textbook definition wise, but you think about how many times, and maybe, airline wise, it's not as prevalent, but a lot of the low level flying, a lot of around airport flying I'm doing, it's like they typically do issue it to both aircraft.
Right.
And I also thought it was strange, not being an investigator. I was like, wow, they only gave it to the helicopter and they gave it to him early and they gave it to him once and that was it. And you can tell that guy was really focused on the shit that was going on runway 1. like with their takeoff clearances, like his attention was certainly focused on the other runway. At least it seemed like for me. And so he's like, he checked that legal box, but you know, and like I brought up the point of, it's easy to look back in hindsight and be like, what the man? But you know, realistically, that guy, if it was more of that traditional sense of how that's ran, he would have issued it to both and followed up, probably knowing that they're still on a colliding course, because they give a second call if it gets worse.
Right.
So legal box, yeah, probably. And I don't know that it's directly his fault, but I don't know. I'm used to seeing more from a scene avoid collision alert kind of situation from a controller's perspective, maybe.
Right. So the report goes on to say that air traffic control issued appropriate reports to PAT 25. Again, PAT 25 is the helicopter here. And there's two types of alerts that you can, or two types of advisories that you could give to traffic. And one is a traffic advisory. And that is, hey, for your situational awareness, there's an aircraft at this position, advise when you have them in sight type of thing. There's also a traffic alert. And a traffic alert is a lot more urgent. I've gotten them mostly flying in the small airplanes, a handful of times, not many, but every once in a while they'll say traffic alert, traffic 1 o'clock, less than 1 mile, same altitude, advise you turn left immediately, climb 500 feet. And then you comply with that.
Do that.
It is ultimately the pilot in command's decision as to how to respond to that, but it is something that air traffic control can do. So a traffic alert is the one we just talked about, and a traffic advisory is for situational awareness, and you ask if you can maintain visual separation and things like that. So you're going to hear that come out here in just a second. Point number 22 that the NTSB makes. Although the local controller provided an initial traffic advisory to the crew of PAT 25 in accordance with the appropriate regulations, he did not provide a corresponding advisory to the crew of Flight 5342 regarding PAT 25's location and intention, which could have increased situational awareness for the flight crew of Flight 5342. This is interesting. The crew of 5342 is in a very high workload environment at this point in time. They are now doing what's called a circling approach, and we haven't talked about what that means yet, but when you're flying into the Reagan Airport, and they're in what's called a north flow, meaning they're landing and taking off to the north. Runway 1 is the direction of almost true north on the compass. 360 or 000 is true north, where 010 is just 10 degrees to the east of true north. So runway 01 is very, very north oriented. And what they do, the NTSB talks about this in the report, I'm going to talk about it in a minute, is in order to create more separation and avoid gridlock at the airport, the air traffic controllers at Reagan will issue an aircraft that's on the approach to runway 1, again, the main runway that they use when they're in a north flow. They will say, hey, can you accept a circle to land runway 33, which now takes the aircraft off of a prescribed instrument approach, which means that the autopilot can be hooked up. You've got all of these different indications in the cockpit that just guide you right down to the runway. It's super easy. They now are in what's called a visual segment. And so they're getting to I believe it's the George Washington Bridge. They make a right turn there. They follow the shoreline of the Potomac, and then they make a left turn to line up on runway 33. So now runway 33 is oriented 40 degrees off of runway 1. So it's quite a big turn. You're doing it visually. You're looking out the left side of the airplane because that's going to be where the runway is. So again, just to paint the picture, if you're sitting in your car listening to this or wherever you may be, you're driving in towards one specific runway. They tell you to circle runway 33. Now you have to make a right turn away from the original intended runway that you were expected to land on. You're now looking out the left side of the airplane, trying to set up for this new runway, which is, again, 40 degrees off of what your heading originally was. And then you make this big left turn to line up on that new runway. So you're very visual. You are outside. You have a high workload. You're looking out at the runway. Okay, are we at the right altitude? Are we at the right lateral point here to actually make a stabilized approach to this runway? So everybody's attention is looking left. PAT 25 is to the lower right side of this aircraft. You are not looking down where they are. In addition, the NTSB published a video, a simulation of what this helicopter would have looked like to the aircraft based on the time of day, based on the lighting, all of those things. And that helicopter blends into the city lights of Washington, D.C. Almost unbelievably. And they also had what's called very little relative motion, where relative motion is when you're essentially on a collision course, something in the background is not moving based on where you are. because you're on that same trajectory, they're not moving, so you don't see the relative motion of where that aircraft actually is, which would give your eye something to grab onto. So it is likely that 5342 never saw this helicopter until the very, very last second, and it was too late to avoid a collision. So just something to consider here as we talk about what it actually means to circle the land. I got off topic. Anyways, the air traffic controller did not provide a corresponding advisory to the crew of 5342 regarding PATS 25's location and intention, which could have increased situational awareness for the crew of 5342. We just talked about that. Due to degraded radio reception, the crew of PAT 25 did not receive information regarding Flight 5342's circling approach to runway 33. Christian, why don't you tell us what that means in the eyes of PAT 25?
So you're flying this helicopter down a known route, and you can tell, and I'm glad you brought up the NTSB animation. For those like Kyle was alluding to, if you're traveling, you're driving right now, you're sitting at home, whatever it may be, check that animation out. It's a short 8-minute video from the NTSB that does a great job of animating what it looked like from the front of both aircraft, and then also overlays the internal like voice recording from inside and the air traffic control overlay. So it's very helpful to visualize this. They have a little diagram up top that shows exactly where everybody is. It's great. So for PAT 25, for them to miss a very important portion of that traffic alert or that crew, or, alert from the air traffic controllers, that completely degrades their situational awareness. So not understanding maybe exactly what the aircraft they're flying towards is doing, because a part of that transmission was cut out. And again, in this animation, they do a great job of specifically highlighting what part of the transmission they believe they heard. And that circle to land portion, along with a number of other portions of the air traffic control communication, does get broken up, which is a big problem for them.
Right. So to paint this picture just a little bit further, the aircraft, the PAT 25, the helicopter is flying southbound along the shoreline of the Potomac River. And as they are flying southbound, they are looking through night vision goggles, which night vision goggles are essentially, imagine binoculars that attach to your helmet. They swing down in front of your eyes, and you're looking through binoculars while you're trying to fly the airplane. So your situational awareness and the amount of lateral distance or peripheral vision that you have is severely limited because you're looking through these night vision goggles. And so what they are looking at straight ahead of them is the arrival corridor to runway 1. So all they see, again, it's nighttime. All they see is a bunch of landing lights, which is the LED light that sits on the nose of the airplane, of all airplanes. They see a bunch of those stacked up on their way into runway 1. The air traffic controller says, "Do you see the CRJ 700? They say affirmative. And they say, pass behind that aircraft. And they also lose that they're circling to runway 33. So now they miss that the CRJ 700 is circling to runway 33, which would immediately alert them to the fact that I'm looking straight ahead. That's the runway 1 arrivals. I need to be looking to my left because that's where the runway 33 arrival corridor is going to be. Again, the huge problem here is that there's a helicopter route that directly conflicts with the arrival corridor to runway 33. That's the big problem here. At perfect spacing, and that means like everybody's doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing. The helicopter is supposed to be at 200 feet over this shore of the Potomac, and the aircraft is supposed to be at 300 feet. That is a completely unacceptable distance of separation. So the good intention of the air traffic controller was to say, CRJ 700 circling to runway 33, do you have it in sight? The helicopter confirms, yes, we have them in sight, but they didn't hear because there was a break in the radio transmission that the aircraft was circling to runway 33. So they missed that. So they don't have that information. So all they hear is CRJ 700 on approach to the airport. Do you have them in sight? Yep, we got them in sight. The controller then says, maintain visual separation. It is now the pilot's responsibility to maintain that separation. The controller has done what they are essentially tasked with doing. So now the helicopter is expected to turn left and pass behind the CRJ as the CRJ is on approach to the airport. Again, theoretically, this keeps everybody safe, but this is just an unacceptable use of airspace. You cannot have a helicopter route underneath an approach corridor with this close of proximity. It's just unbelievable that existed. when I first saw this accident and understood the helicopter routes there. The airspace in DCA is unlike any other place because of the unique nature of what happens in Washington, D.C., of course, being our nation's capital. They have all of this different airspace, military use, special flight rules areas, all sorts of things that it just doesn't exist anywhere else. So I was amazed when I learned about this. Anyways, one thing that I'll point out here, when I was a young, aspiring pilot and just starting to get into my private pilot training, and that's like the very, very first training that you do, I would fly with my dad a lot. And my dad would say, we'd get a traffic advisory when we would be out flying, and he'd say, don't report them in sight. And I was always like, why not? As a pilot, you're mission oriented. Hey, yep, we got them in sight. We can do it. Let's keep the mission going. And my dad was like, because I don't want the responsibility. That's air traffic control's job. They are down there to keep aircraft separated. I'm not going to maintain the visual separation. I have 500 other things going on. So I see them. I'm not telling them that though, because I want them to have the responsibility to keep me safe. I thought it was dumb at the time. Now, having grown up a little bit and maturing, I'm like, man, that guy he had his head on straight. So anyways, I don't know if you do that at all, Christian.
Oh, that's a funny take. Actually, I've heard that story.
Yeah. I remember it very clearly. I remember exactly where we were when he taught me that lesson.
Sounds an awful lot like your dad too.
Yeah. It's 100% what my dad does. Okay, so moving on here. The PAT 25. So we have said now, just as a recap, we've said that they, have reported the aircraft in sight. The PAT 25 instructor pilot did not positively identify Flight 5342 at the time of the initial traffic advisory, despite his statement that he had the traffic in sight and his request for visual separation. So my understanding of that is that based on the cockpit voice recorder that they took out of PAT 25, the helicopter, they did not actually see where the CRJ was, although he said, yes, we have him in sight. This is, again, a perfect example of my dad's policy of don't call them in sight, because you may just be so used to the traffic in sight, visual separation. And if you've done it 1,000 times, the 1,001st time feels like it's okay to do, where you actually don't have that traffic in sight, but you're just trying to get one thing off of your plate of things that you need to deal with. Yeah, we'll deal with it. Okay, we'll figure them out in a second. And then you just don't. And that is one of the links in the accident chain here. Christian, anything to add there?
No, and I just think that it's important for us to maybe continue visiting the traffic alert too. We had started with that topic. Let's make sure we close that loop, because they made their initial check mark, but there could have been some subsequent follow-ups from air traffic and confirmation from the pilots. And I think a really unique or interesting part of this report is that call didn't go to the airliner. It didn't go to American 5342. It only went to the helicopter. And then a lot of attention from air traffic goes back to the operations on that runway 1 you were talking about. Landings and takeoffs, that's the busy runway at DC. They were keeping flow moving there. And it's almost like they're like, hey, American, you circle over to runway 33, PAT 25, pass behind them. We good. All right, back to runway 1. But let's unbox that a little bit more and close the loop on the actual separation calls.
Yeah, that leads us to point 29 here in the report that says interference that obscured the controller's circling to call, the microphone keying that blocked the PAT 25 crew from receiving the instructions to quote unquote pass behind, ambiguous visual cues, and the lack of an integrated traffic awareness and alerting system likely reinforced the PAT 25 crew's expectation bias that the airplane was among traffic approaching runway 1 and did not pose a conflict. So the expectation bias, we expect all of these aircraft to be arriving to runway 1. We did not hear that this aircraft was arriving runway 33, so we have no reason to expect them to be there. And then we missed the pass behind. So now, all you have heard is, do you have a CRJ 700 in sight? Yeah, we got him. Great. Maintain visual separation. That's all you heard.
If you watch that video too, it's interesting with the internal cockpit voice recorder from PAT 25, the Black Hawk. They actually talk about how busy the approach is to runway 1. They're like, well, something along the lines of, I'm paraphrasing, like they got them stacked up tonight. And, the pilot flying, says, yeah, it's busy. And so it's interesting, like, they have a lot of airplanes in sight, actually. And so to check that box, again, like what we did earlier in their traffic control shoes, put yourself in the shoes of the Black Hawk crew. They're looking ahead, and all they catch is, do you have an aircraft in front of you in sight? And they're like talking about it. It's like, yeah, we got a bunch of them in sight. So, talking to that expectation bias, they're looking straight ahead, when in reality, the airplane that air traffic's alluding to is immediately off their left shoulder. And that's not where they're looking, as it appears from the report.
Right. And in fact, one of the things that they end up saying, Christian, further in that video, is the instructor pilot says, let's move left. I think he wants us to move left. And that's when the collision happens, is right then. And so they're in essence flying blind because of the missed communications that happened based on a keyed mic, interference, whatever it may be. Just the appropriate information did not get passed. So a little bit of normalization of deviance here, and just the wrong time of keying the mic to not quite get all of the information. So for any young pilots listening, or any pilots listening, this is a great point to reinforce. If you didn't hear it all, or you have any confusion, or you expect that you may have expectation bias, it's always good to ask. It's always great to ask, because this is a limitation in the air traffic control system, is voice and radio, and how that happens. Normally it works fantastic, but there are limitations and risks associated with it. An additional point that the NTSB makes here, and we talked about this just a few moments ago, where the helicopter is expected to be at 200 feet and the aircraft is expected to be at about 300 feet at this point in time during these different maneuvers that they're doing, with the helicopter being on helicopter route 4 and the aircraft being on the approach to runway 33. This is point number 31 that they make, due to allowable tolerances of the helicopter's altimeter system, it is likely that the crew of PAT 25 observed a altimeter altitude about 100 feet lower than the helicopter's actual altitude, resulting in the crew erroneously believing that they were under the published maximum altitude for Route 4. So, Christian, do you want to paraphrase that for the listeners?
Paraphrasing, basically the flight crew thought they were lower than they actually were on the route, which, talking about that expectation bias, if you are in that position, you're in a position where you're like, I'm low, I'm good, I'm clear. Even if we miss the traffic, the process and the procedure that's been built here will keep me safe. And, I go back to that animation that the NTSB put out, which, by the way, was fantastic. They did a great job with that. Incredible. So helpful for the viewer's situational awareness of what was going on. You can tell that helicopter's actual altitude, amongst that entire, and the crew calls it. The instructor pilot says we're high. And that correction really never transpires throughout the course. Like they do descend a hair, and then it comes right back up to that 300 feet. And unfortunately, that just put them on that perfect collision course. And so, that altimeter becomes a big factor in this accident, and another big open hole in the Swiss cheese model. Right now, we have a component of the aircraft that is telling us something other than what we expect. And in the flying world, especially when you're really relying on instruments, we're taught to trust those instruments. And so when you're trusting an instrument that's giving you information that ends up not being completely true, we have an issue here. And ultimately that's what we see transpire in January 25.
Huge issue. Yeah. I mean, your instrument, why would you disbelieve your instruments? That's what they're there for. We're trained. Trust the instruments. Do not trust the seat of your pants feel. And of course,
I do a lot. How are you
going to judge 200 feet?
I do a lot of instructing for new and aspiring pilots in the instrument world, and our first lesson is your body is wrong. It's like literally welcome to the course. Number 2, your body is wrong. Don't trust what your body says. Trust those instruments. It's literally lesson number 1 in teaching people how to fly in the clouds or in low visual environments. And the nighttime is treated that way. 80% of your visual perception is through your visuals, and it's degraded at night. So, in reality, it's almost like that's an environment where you really need to trust those instruments. And that is lesson number 1. And, it just makes for a bad situation. But you can tell that they're off the entirety of that portion of the route that gets close to the airport.
Right. In essence, what we're saying here is this crew PAT 25 was set up for failure.
You have now a second group that's in that boat, right? We talked about that with air traffic control in the tower. We're now talking about that for this flight crew in the helicopter. They missed key portions of a transmission that very well could have kept them safe. You have a second, part of this snowball that's now completely in a almost helpless position. There's things everybody could have done better, but in a lot of ways, in that concept of somewhat set up for failure here.
Right. Point number 33. The Federal Aviation Administration and the Army failed to identify the incompatibility between the helicopter route's low maximum altitudes and the error tolerances of altimeters, which contributed to helicopters regularly flying higher than published maximum altitudes and potentially crossing into the runway 33 glide path. Again, that's the vertical profile that an aircraft flies when they're approaching that runway 33 runway. So that's just essentially says exactly what Christian said. There were incompatibilities with the airspace here, and there was a failure to comprehend that. Point number 38 goes on to something that we discussed just a moment ago. The flight crew of 5342, the CRJ, did not see the helicopter until it was too late to avoid a collision because of the high workload imposed during the final phase of their approach and due to the helicopter's low visibility and lack of apparent motion. That's what we already talked about with them being hard to see based on no movement against the horizon. So I won't spend more time discussing that. Point number 40. This is really interesting, and this is another setup that puts the Reagan controllers at a disadvantage. Point number 40 says, Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport Air Traffic Control Tower routinely received less than requested miles in trail spacing, how far apart airplanes are from each other, from the Potomac controllers, which is the approach controllers. Those are the people that are actually bringing you down from altitude and setting you up on the arrival corridor, or on the approach corridor, rather. They're controlling you from something like 25,000 feet down to 3,000 feet. They get you set up on the approach, and then tower takes over, and they're the ones that tell you clear to land. Jumping back into this, they were received less than required or less than requested miles in trail spacing from Potomac controllers, which increased controller workload by requiring them to generate additional spacing to prevent delays or gridlock. The practice of offloading arrival traffic onto the approach of runway 1 by asking pilots if they could accept a circling approach to runway 33 was a routine mitigation strategy for Reagan controllers to generate spacing that was not provided by Potomac control. So this runway 33 was a steam offlet valve, essentially, to reduce the pressure that they were facing based on the natural challenges that they have with that airport. It's a small airport. There's 2 runways. Those runways intersect. When you're using the same runway for takeoff and landing, there's challenges associated with that because you got to get aircraft off the ground. If you're not getting aircraft off the ground, that gridlocks the airport because now there's a big taxiway lineup. Now you can't taxi aircraft into the gate. You can't get aircraft off of the gate because they need the space. So all of a sudden you can gridlock the entire airport. So now the controllers are saying, we got to get people off to runway 33 because that gives us more room down the field to be able to launch people off of runway 1. We can get them in position earlier. It's a mitigation strategy that they were forced to use that puts them in a position of disadvantage here. Anything to add on that, Christian?
No, I don't think so. Good point.
Points 42 through 47 all talk about essentially operational pressure on the Reagan controllers. Reliance on pilot-applied visual separation as a primary means of separating traffic introduced an unacceptable risk to the Reagan Airport Class Bravo airspace. Class Bravo airspace is the busiest airspace in the nation. I think it's around 30 airports. But they would use visual separation procedures, which is what we heard here. So, maintain visual separation, And most of the time that's fine because you do see the traffic that you're, arriving with and you do have them in sight and you know exactly which one you're talking to. I'll use NorCal Approach as an example here, flying into San Francisco all the time. They pair us up as we work our way into runway 28 in San Francisco. They're parallel runways. So we'll arrive in parallel with each other. So if you're ever flying in, you may look out your window and see another aircraft directly next to you. It's really cool. It's in fact one of the coolest things that we get to do in commercial aviation. But the NorCal controllers are really, really good at saying your traffic is 12 o'clock, 6 miles in a right-hand turn. Do you have them in sight? Yeah, we got them in sight. Maintain visual separation. They're pairing. You'll be catching them. Cleared the approach, runway 28 left. Something along those lines. So they make sure, hey, this is the specific target that you are looking for. Do you have them in sight? It's a Boeing 737. It's a Boeing 777, whatever it may be. And a lot of times we actually are sequenced in a staggered manner. So, they'll say, hey, they're going to maintain, they're going to stay in front of you. Do not overtake them. They say things like that. And so you get very specific instructions from the NorCal controller. So it's not uncommon to use visual separation procedures, but in a situation like this, where a helicopter is prescribed to be on a very specific route and an airplane is flying a very specific route over the top of them, you cannot do that here. It is amazing to me that this route structure exists, that I just can't get my head around it. Christian, anything to add there?
No, I don't think too much, just routine. I mean, I see that a lot in Chicago, right? You land the 2.8s in Chicago O'Hare. It's very similar environment like the 2.8s in San Fran, where you have airplanes off your left or your right. So not abnormal to see things like that. And the circling to land that we talked about earlier, you're on the instrument approach, you break off for a visual, circle to another runway. Might sound crazy or scary. We teach that all the time. I go back to some of the kids I teach in flight school. That's what we talk about very early and often is that practice that circle to land. So standard maneuvers in a lot of areas made very complicated by unique airspace. I think a good point to bring up here is that DC, and Kyle kind of alluded to it earlier, opens up the door for a very unique position in situations. This doesn't, you look at this accident, you look at this operation, you don't see it or find it really anywhere else in the country. It's very specific to our nation's capital. We don't have those in every state. So it is unique. And I think it's important to recognize that and remind yourself of that. Is we have a lot of normal operations happening, circling to land, visual separation, that happens across the board around the globe, really. And you have a very microscopic, unique scenario with the DC airspace and specifically Reagan's approaches. So just something to keep in mind.
Absolutely. I think that's a great point to be made there. These are normal operations until you stack too many of them on top of each other, and then it becomes an unsafe situation. On that note, point 45 here does essentially point to that being a challenge here, Christian. It says the long-standing practice of relying on pilot-applied visual separation as the principal means of separating helicopter and fixed-wing traffic in the DC area between the controllers and the Army and other helicopter operators led to a drift in operating practices among controllers and helicopter crews that increased the likelihood of a midair collision. Normalization of deviance is a factor in this accident. I think a big factor in this accident.
Sure.
That goes on to then talk about essentially how we could have caught this ahead of time. And one of the points that they make, this is point number 52, annual reviews of helicopter route charts as required by Federal Aviation Administration Order 7210.3 Delta Delta would have provided an opportunity to identify the risk posed by the proximity of Route 4 to the runway 33 approach path. But there is no evidence to support that these reviews were being performed at the Reagan, Washington National Airport. Normalization of deviance.
Right.
Not good. Granted, I don't know who conducts those. I don't know if that's an FAA thing. I don't know if that's a controller thing. I don't know who does that. So that's an interesting thing here. And now I want to point out, if you're a nervous flyer listening to this, which probably 95% of our listeners are, these helicopter routes were pulled down immediately after the accident. I think it was 3 days after the accident, or maybe even less than that. I'm not looking at it specifically, but I know it was in a very short time. Helicopter Route 4 was closed indefinitely. That was the route that was directly underneath the runway 33 approach corridor. They issued flight restrictions, and they issued changes to this airspace that dramatically altered Reagan's operations. And so I do want to point out that they took very positive action to fix these challenges or fix these obviously dangerous issues immediately following the accident. So nowadays, that Route 4 is no longer available. My understanding is that if any helicopter has to use the terminal area, which is the direct vicinity of the airport, they close any commercial arrival traffic down. So I know immediately in the aftermath of this accident, some of our pilot team was out flying into DCA, and they would say, "Oh yeah, there's holding, there's delays." As the controllers work to figure out what is their new normal, how do we keep everything separated. And I haven't heard lately. I actually haven't flown into DCA since this happened. But I haven't heard lately that there have been, crazy challenges or anything associated with flying into DCA as far as delays go. It sounds like they got these things sorted out. But I do want to point out here that what we are reading here is what the NTSB has pointed out, and this does not talk about the fixes that have already been implemented. So if you're a nervous flyer, I want you to know that those fixes have not taken a year to come out. They jumped on those immediately. So really important thing to note there. If you're a nervous flyer, the appropriate bodies have acted in a way that I personally, again, my opinion, find appropriate to make sure that things like this don't happen in the future. Christian, anything to add on that?
I think important to add for that big listener base of nervous flyers, we'll finish up with a couple of, just general thoughts about how this pertains to safe travel. And so I don't think it's appropriate for us to dive into that quite yet. We'll finish up the report and then we'll close on those.
Sounds good. There were some other things that were brought up. I just highlighted number 57 that talks about the air traffic or the aircraft's TCAS system, traffic collision avoidance system. There were a lot of questions that came out from that. Why did it not work to prevent this accident? And what the NTSB says, although the airplane's traffic alert and collision avoidance system operated as designed, it was ineffective in preventing the collision because of current activation criteria and resolution advisory inhibit altitudes. I believe on the CRJ at below 900 feet, you are inhibited from getting what's called a resolution advisory. A resolution advisory is something that we are required to comply with, and it would say something like traffic climb, and it'll paint a green box onto your primary flight display, which is the display that we look at in front of us when we're flying, that would tell you exactly where to fly the aircraft to. And all you tell air traffic control in that situation is TCAS RA, and they go, okay, let us know when you're clear. Essentially, the aircraft will tell you when you're clear of the conflict. But because of how this works, when you're down low to the ground, you do not want erroneous TCAS RAs going off, because then it creates another issue of normalization of deviance. Because what you can imagine here is if you're coming into an you're coming into an airport, and on every other landing. Now, let me paint the picture a little bit further. When you're landing in an airport, there's other aircraft that are taxiing out. The principal way that air traffic control identifies who we are is what's called our transponder. Transponder is a system that you put a unique 4-digit code into. The radar on the air traffic control tower talks to our transponder. Our transponder then sends information back, and it tells the air traffic control tower who we are. Those transponders are also how our TCAS system works. So our transponders essentially talk to each other and say, oh, you're climbing, you're descending, this is the altitude you're at. The TCAS system can then make a calculation and say, collision is imminent here. I'm going to issue a TCAS RA. So as you can imagine, you're flying into an airport, there's an aircraft taxiing out on the ground, and they're sitting just short of the runway, which is, just a few hundred feet off of the left side of the aircraft, let's say, as we're landing. If our TCAS does not inhibit, and every time we're coming into an airport, we get a traffic climb, we are going to be conditioned to ignore that. Then you get into a normalization of deviance because the system works erroneously. That is not good for human factors. So they inhibited these warnings below 900 feet on the CRJ 900 or CRJ 700. I believe the altitude is 900 feet there. I could be wrong by a couple hundred feet. But that is the idea as to why it inhibits. So it's actually a good idea logically, but I'm not sure how to refine that, just being that I'm not a systems engineer. I'm sure that there could theoretically be a better system for that. But I just want to point out that that's why that TCAS RA system did not work. Christian? Thoughts on that?
Great explanation. No, great explanation.
Right on. All right. So that essentially wraps up what I found to be the important parts of these bullet points for our nervous flyer community. I do want to read here what the NTSB has come out with as their probable cause and then contributing factors. And I'm basically going to read this word for word. But again, this is just something that we talked about in the immediate aftermath of the accident. We jumped on social media, and I always have a challenge whenever these things happen because I don't know what to say, because people come to us and they want answers for what happened. But the reality is you just don't know. I didn't know that, the helicopter did not hear the pass behind command. I did not know that they didn't hear the runway 33 circling advisory that the air traffic controllers published. We just didn't know those factors. I mean, we could piece together that they were on Route 4, this aircraft was circling to runway 33, and they crashed into each other. Of course, that became obvious within 15 minutes of the accident. But this is something that I want the nervous flyer to put in your basket of tricks, if you will, whenever an incident happens, whether it's something that's overseas or something that's here in the United States. Hopefully we don't have any more accidents of this scale. It had been a long time since we had a fatal accident here in the United States in the commercial aircraft system. But what I want you to know in these timeframes is that the most important thing that you can do is not go to sensational places where information is published and it's clickbait. I mean, that's exactly what it is. As a service business owner in this current environment, you are incentivized to make clickbait. You get paid to make clickbait. It is really a disgusting factor of what goes on in the world today, but it is the reality. So our business model, of course, is not doing that. It is to provide, good quality service to the folks that trust us with their safety. And of course, clickbait is very much not a part of what we do. But there are business models out there that's what they thrive on. That is how they survive and how they, feed their families, unfortunately. I mean, that is just the nature of the world. But it is designed to invoke a feeling of fear, anger, terror in you, anything like that. It is designed to do that. And so I want you to know that the NTSB is going to do the right thing. They are going to point the finger at who needs to have the finger pointed at them. And what that comes out in is what I'm about to read right now, which is the NTSB statement on probable cause. Christian, before I hit that, anything you want to add to my diatribe about clickbait?
No, it's so important. And that's just such a great point to bring up. I was going to, in our kind of our conclusion here, is that I flash back to January of 2025. Kyle and I lived on the phone together for, days in that aftermath. We don't live in the same state. We're on the other end of the country. But, we were talking a ton in the aftermath of that. And it is so, I don't want to say tempting from our side, but tempting from the quote unquote machine side to just throw that speculation out there because it gets people, engaged, clicks, comments, drives revenue. And I think that's quite the opposite of what needs to happen here. As I look to other things going on around the country right now, whether it be, in aviation or things completely outside of flying, take the time to pause and wait for the organizations that are tasked with doing their job of investigating an incident to come out with the facts of what happened, because they are going to, avoid speculation like the plague, and they're going to stick to what they can prove to be true. And even when they do, they use a lot of words like could or may have. I've noticed that a lot in the points you've brought up. There's no definitive like 100% because we'll never truly know. But as much fact as possible has come out. And I just remember so much of what we talked about in the wake of this accident was remain patient. In 12 to 18 months, a final report will be issued. And when that happens, we will talk about what actually happened here. And so, this is a year of patience coming to fruition as this podcast and, some of our community calls after this is going to be talking about the facts, not dying on a hill of speculation here, because it's just so dangerous, not only for those involved in this accident and this tragedy, but so dangerous for our industry as a whole. One of the points I'd like to bring up when we close is just how frankly proud I am of this industry because it scrutinizes its losses so much. And it's something that we can applaud. And I know that's weird to say when we look at such a massive tragedy, but I'm proud of how much we scrutinize these, and staying away from those speculations is incredibly important as we seek the truth and the facts about what actually happens.
Well said. Yeah, incredibly well said. With that, the NTSB statement on probable cause. We determined that the probable cause of this accident was the FAA's placement of a helicopter route in close proximity to a runway approach path, their failure to regularly review and evaluate helicopter routes and available data, and their failure to act on recommendations to mitigate the risk of a midair collision near the Reagan National Airport, as well as the air traffic control system's over-reliance on visual separation in order to promote efficient traffic flow without consideration for the limitations of the see and avoid concept. Also causal was the lack of effective pilot-applied visual separation by the helicopter crew, which resulted in a midair collision. Additional causal factors were the tower team's loss of situation awareness and degraded performance due to high workload of the combined helicopter and local control positions, and the absence of a risk assessment process to identify and mitigate real-time operational risk factors, which resulted in misprioritization of duties, inadequate traffic advisories, and the lack of safety alerts to both flight crews. Also causal was the Army's failure to ensure pilots were aware of the effects of error tolerances on barometric altimeters in their helicopters, which resulted in the crew flying above the maximum published helicopter route altitude. That last statement to me is insane. What do you mean errors appropriate to an altimeter system? It's an altimeter system. How are you supposed to know if there's errors associated with it? I just know, oh yeah, this helicopter, this one's off by 50 feet. That is unbelievable. Unbelievable. There should be no errors in the altimeter system. I can't believe that's in there, actually. On to the contributing factors. The limitations of traffic awareness and collision alerting systems on both aircraft, which precluded effective alerting of the impending collision to the flight crews. An unsustainable airport arrival rate, increasing traffic volume with a changing fleet mix, meaning different types of aircraft, and airline scheduling practices at DCA, which regularly strained the DCA air traffic control workforce and degraded safety over time. The Army's lack of a fully implemented safety management system, which should have identified and addressed hazards associated with altitude exceedances on the Washington, D.C. helicopter routes. The FAA's failure across multiple organizations to implement previous NTSB recommendations, including ADSB in, which we didn't really discuss in the bullet points, and to follow and fully integrate its established safety management system, which should have led to several organizational and operational changes based on previously identified risks that were known to management, and the absence of effective data sharing and analysis among the FAA, aircraft operators, and other relevant organizations. A lot of contributing factors there. The causal factors are, of course, what actually caused the accident to happen. Christian, thoughts, comments, additions, anything you want to add here?
Couple. Yeah, I think it's really important, one, to remember how we started, which was the Swiss cheese model, or those links in the chain. This accident to me is it's a pack of cheese from Costco, man. There's so many layers of just little microscopic holes that just allowed this to happen. This is not a systemic fleet-wide issue. And I think it's important to know that this was really locally centralized to the DC's complicated airspace. And I just think that as you look at those layers of cheese, there's so many we talked about, just, visual separations and technology on the aircraft and procedural routes that were all intended in good practice and good faith to keep people safe. And it just was a massive pack of cheese that had just the right configuration of holes to allow this to happen. And it's really sad to see that happened when in hindsight, it's so easy to look at these findings and be like, why wasn't this changed sooner? And it comes back to a lot of the points that we've already talked about. We don't need to review every single one of them, but it's just, it's a very clear example of that Swiss cheese model, or those links in the chain. It's a big pack of cheese. It's a long link of chain that just aligned to make this come together. I think the other thing I want to really bring up is something I just mentioned a few minutes ago, which is NTSB minced no words in pointing fingers here and placing where they felt that blame needed to go. And again, I go back to how we started. It's a separate organization of the FAA because it allows them to have that third-party unbiased finger pointing capacity without a bunch of blowback. Think about if someone like the FAA were to have to do this investigation and publish their findings. I mean, shoot, it's their controllers, it's their routes, it's their airspace. That's a lot of things that they don't want to probably uncover, whereas the NTSB had the ability to come in 74 very clear points, be like, here is exactly what we feel went wrong. And I want to make sure this point is emphasized, especially to the nervous flyer, the big community of people we're talking to here. I am so proud to be a part of the aviation industry because we do a great job of acknowledging where we've gone wrong and admitting where we're wrong. NTSB is not directly an aviation organization, although it plays a lot into aviation. And I think the FAA does do a great job of accepting, where things could have been better and taking the findings from these incidents and accidents and implementing very important positive change to help keep people safe in the future. I certainly can't say this definitively, but I can tell you, based on looking at a number of industries, aviation does a phenomenal job of learning from their mistakes and being able to own it when they did something wrong. I think this is a textbook example of that. Like, as you look to car accidents, as you look to, just accidents in your home or anything like medical, I think medical probably gets close to aviation, but flying and the professionals and the NTSB and FAA and operators do a fantastic job of sticking their hand up and saying, we made a mistake. We're going to fix it to ensure this never happens again. And as you look back over how long it had been since a major fatality-based aviation accident from U.S. carriers happened in this country, a lot of days and years passed before it happened again. And I think that's a testament to really the just incredible professionals in the industry. And I think it's easy to get caught up in so much of that sensationalism we talked about earlier and so much like attention to aviation accidents and incidents because they do fuel that clickbait, when in reality, we are seeing safer air travel than ever because of technology, because of processes, because of systems. And as you jump on that next airplane, you step foot off that jet bridge and you walk into the cabin, I know this is on the top of mind for a lot of our listeners. And I think what you have to remember, and the most important thing for me to emphasize that you take with you into that assigned seat that you sit in, is that there are thousands of people working day in and day out to make sure that that seat you're sitting on is the safest seat that you could possibly be sitting on. And really, all things considered, if you look at the data, aviation is the safest mode of travel and transportation that you could possibly sit in. Far better than the seat you could sit in your car, far better than a motorcycle or a train. But I think it's easy to get caught up in, wow, there's a lot that went wrong here. True. And I think the industry is going to do a great job of learning from those mistakes and owning them. And I'm proud to be a part of that industry. And you just have to remember that the next time you get on a flight, that these are an incredibly rare alignment of those cheese holes or links on chains. And even when those incredibly rare moments happen, there's a lot of work that goes into making sure it doesn't happen again.
Absolutely. Well said. The only thing I'll add here is just from my perspective in the seat that I sit in is, in being, a 1 year in captain, the amount of reports that we are required to write based on very small nuanced things that happen in the airline operation is just amazing, because this is data that is tracked and kept tabs on. We have a union that keeps this information, processes it, works with the company to ensure that we have different ways to handle what the pilots and the flight attendants are experiencing out there on what we call the line. That's just when we're out flying. It's really an incredible safety culture that we do have. And so I do want to also, Christian, reemphasize the point that this is the safest form of transportation in history. I mean, it is incredible. I go to work every day with the utmost confidence in our ability to execute the mission safely. Utmost confidence in the people that I work with the people who are behind the scenes, with the aircraft that they give us to operate on a daily basis, in the training that we have. I mean, absolutely everything that goes into it. I have all the confidence in the world that I'll get home to my family at the end of the day, and that everybody on board my aircraft is going to be safe. It's just truly, truly incredible. So I do also, again, for the nervous flyers, this has probably been a bit of an exhausting episode to listen to, because it is problem. Here's what happened. But at the end of the day, it is amazing, just to reemphasize your point, Christian, that you already so eloquently communicated. The NTSB, being that neutral third party, can go, here's the problem. That's it. Fix it. And it's great. Again, to bring it back to my dad, we're working on a little AI project together, and he's like, stop being nice to AI. Tell it to fix stuff. And in this case, the NTSB is the one that's able to not be nice and just say, this is the problem and it needs to be fixed. We don't care about feelings here, which is fantastic. So, I am just grateful to see that the NTSB did come out with a report like this, the way that they did, and that these fixes have been already, the main fix at helicopter route being the structural, absolute underlying principle that caused this accident. That was fixed immediately as it relates to DCA. So, Christian, with that, I did do an Instagram poll yesterday to take some questions from some of our nervous flyers, but I think with the length of the episode and the weight of the episode today, we'll save that for our next go on the podcast. But it's always great to have the opportunity to chat with you and discuss things like this. Thanks so much for listening to From the Flight Deck. Christian, anything to leave our wonderful folks with?
No, sir. I think we've covered enough today, and we'll catch you guys in the next one. Thanks for taking the time to listen today.